So, welcome to another episode of the Being and Doing podcast, where I try to bring you the stories of the unique individual that are all around us. And tonight, I'm very happy to have an extremely special person, Dr. Wendy Behary. Correct me if I'm mispronouncing your
No, that was perfect. Thanks.
And the first time I encountered her and her work is through a course on narcissism. And there are many people that talk about this topic, but there was one thing that was really impressionable for me about Wendy, which is that she embodied the empathic strength that is required to deal with narcissistic individuals. And I think this is the thing I really wanted to explore and to learn from. And also referring to the book, I think this is the Jedi Force used for good. And I'm really curious to hear more. So welcome, Wendy.
Thank you, Alexandra. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me.
So I would start with a question of which are some nouns, adjectives, which you describe yourself with?
Describe myself.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That's a different starting question than I'm used to, but let's see. I am a person who is incredibly curious. I am someone who likes a challenge. And I think that's why I ended up working with narcissists, because I was curious and I liked the challenge. I am creative and I'm in some ways I'm very flexible. In other ways, I can be very rigid in terms of my high standards and expectations of myself, where I can be rather tough. But I can also be flexible in my creativity to sort of think outside the box when it comes to strategy. I probably work too hard. I don't know what the adjective is for that, workaholic, I guess, but probably working a little bit too hard these days. But, I think mostly I'm a person who's just, kind of always fascinated by the human condition. And it's what's made me so passionate about my work and so passionate about this subject, and this particular complex personality type that I've been working with for almost 30 years.
And so there are many things I want to start on, but let's start with narcissism because it's the big topic in the room. What is narcissism? Let's just make it really simple.
Well, the word narcissism is really a shortcut for narcissistic personality disorder. So we use it as just sort of an easier way to describe this personality type that happens along a spectrum, like most personality disorders, where anything from the more benign to the more malignant types of narcissism. But very simply put, narcissism, we think of someone who is quite profoundly self-absorbed. It's very important for them to win approval, to make a good impression, to get a lot of audience attention and applause, overtly and covertly, because there are really two types. They can be controlling, they can be charming, they can be very demanding of themselves and others. The hallmark, I guess, way of looking at them is that they are highly entitled to have what they want, do what they want, make the rules, break the rules. They tend to be low in empathy, not impossible. I'll debunk that myth. Not impossible for them to learn how to develop those capacities within themselves, but they are low empathy, low remorse, low accountability. They're tough people to work with because at the core there's so much insecurity, but what you see in front of you is usually this very overcompensatory way of being.
I'm curious. So many relationships are co-created, and I'm curious, when you sit in front of someone who is a narcissist, what is it that happens inside of you?
Many things, depending on how you yourself are put together. I mean, when in the early days of my career and in my own personal life, even sitting with someone who was narcissistic could really raise those old feelings of, uh-oh, it's time to give in. I have to avoid this. I have to find a way out of this horrible feeling that I'm having inside, that maybe I've done something wrong, or that I'm going to get into trouble, or it's dangerous. We can find ourselves being reduced to coping strategies we may have used when we were very small. Like I always tell my colleagues when I'm teaching them, I found myself apologizing for things that weren't my fault and not holding the client accountable. I mean, I learned a lot by making a lot of mistakes and by being very curious. But I do think what we tend to feel most of all in the company of a narcissist is you feel erased. So you feel as if all they're looking at is the reflection of themselves in this thing that becomes like a mirror on you, and they don't really see you. So you become a bit invisible.
And many personality behaviors are described as narcissism. And I guess there are many times that these are mixed and not very developed. So we put everything into the same box and label them kind of devil. And I'm curious how much people actually comes to you, which is labeled as narcissist, but then is actually having another label or something else happening.
It certainly does happen. I mean, I think that we're living in times when the word narcissism is ever so popular. And so anyone who shows any sign of anger, frustration, impatience, showing off, being self-centered is immediately tagged with the label narcissist. That's not true. I mean, it's a narcissistic trait, perhaps. There might be a feature, it may be a mood or a phase, but it doesn't make for a personality, a type of personality. So, yeah, I mean, it's just become a word that's a bit overused, in my opinion. And yet, it's also important that people are able to discover and identify and understand more about this very complicated personality type that can do a lot of harm in relationships. Yeah. So, but we have to be careful not to jump to conclusions.
And that harm, which you're describing, I think it's also important to acknowledge what is the impact of a narcissist in a long-term relationship. And how does that harm look like? Because I feel many, maybe people who are experiencing narcissistic rage or abuse, again, fall into the apologizing or don't have information to recognize what's happening to them.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's ever so true, Alexandra, that so many people don't see it as it's kind of sneaking up. The person that you met who was quite present in the courtship, or at least seemed to be, seemed to know how to say all the right things and do these things that were heroic and be very charming, and is suddenly now missing. And if you come into a relationship with someone who's narcissistic and you yourself have tendencies to be self-doubting, you have tendencies to feel guilt, to feel easily subjugated and fearful of judgment, rejection, humiliation, abandonment, it's easy to get captured under the spell of a narcissist and to be fearful of asserting yourself and to buy into that kind of distorted reality that everyone calls gaslighting, right? That narcissists can foist upon you and have you question yourself and start to wonder if it is your fault or if you're doing something to cause this shift that you're experiencing in your relationship.
And we're talking about these fears of guilt. And I think also what we constantly, I think when people talk about narcissists, it's not enough to recognize that this has happened. Sometimes it takes a long recovery path. And I just reading your book and thinking about this topic, I sometimes feel that we maybe sometimes diminish the amount of time it requires to recover from such abuse or to treat a narcissist. So I'm very curious what you think about that.
It's a very long journey, and it's one that requires some very critical elements for it to be successful. I mean, certainly for those who have been injured, traumatized even by a narcissist in their life, it's going to take time, to heal those wounds, to reassess those attributions that live inside your thinking system and your emotional system, to grieve, to grieve and to let go of guilt and blame and shame that you've carried probably as a big burden for too long. That will take time. I also encourage partners and family members who are recovering to engage in empathy. And as you know from, listening to me or looking at my book, that I guess the one thing I forgot to describe in the adjectives about myself is I'm a very empathic person. And what that means is not that sympathy. It's not feeling sorry for someone. It's not compassion, although I can be compassionate. We all can be compassionate. We can all have sorrow and sympathy for someone. But empathy is very different. And it's really that capacity to learn and understand and feel and experience and make sense out of the experience of another. It doesn't mean you support it, doesn't mean you agree with it, doesn't mean you endorse it. I don't endorse the behaviors of my narcissistic clients, but I understand how they became the way they did. And that's empathy. And I think the more wisdom we develop around narcissism, the more we get it, the more we free ourselves. So when I'm working with someone in recovery, I want to help them to learn all they can about this personality, because the more they can see it and understand it, the more they can see this wasn't about me.
Yeah.
I didn't make this happen. I didn't cause the angry outbursts. It's not my fault that there was sexual addiction. It's not my fault that there was gambling and spending money. It's not my fault that there was control and distorted behaviors.
And actually that compassion and that distinction between sympathy and empathy, actually I'll take one step back. I think the importance of recognizing that this is not me, but observing that this image is projected on every person can be helpful. But then as many people are not trained in understanding that there is transference, and maybe you can talk more about this. How do people maybe in their daily lives stop and see, is a person behaving like this only towards me, or is this a general phenomenon?
Yeah, and the problem with narcissism is they will sometimes behave only that way with a loved one. And out there in the world, they are very light and lively and, generous, the life of the party, lots of fun, easygoing. And so it does cause one to question, maybe it's me, because I'm the one who seems to be the target. I get this question a lot from people in consultation. And what I say is, you're just the safe place behind the scenes. You're the unfortunate but safe place behind the scenes. So, unless you become someone who is more tenuous, more tentative in the life of the narcissist, meaning they have some fear they could actually lose you, and that matters to them, it's not likely going to change. Now, if they start spending a lot more time with more people, even in the workplace where coworkers and subordinates can sometimes start to see some of the signs, especially when there's frustration to be tolerated. They see the narcissist in not so many lovely colors. But partners are going to get the worst of it. And that's the hard part of being able, again, the more you understand about how narcissists are put together, their origins, their makeup, their temperament, the greater the possibility for knowing that you're not causing this, and there's nothing you can do to change it. You can have maybe some influence over the decisions they're making or influence them to get help, but you can't change their personality.
And understanding the origins, what is your, I guess, not generalizable story of origins of narcissism, but maybe a pattern that you observe most in your practice?
Yeah, the most typical origins of narcissism, and we always take this into account with temperament. And we have to assume a lot of things when it comes to biology because we don't have all of that information. So we look for patterns and trends based on stories that have been shared with us in the early assessments. Based on stories we may have heard from siblings and family members when we have the chance to meet them. But it's a kind of, I'll say, anecdotal impression on my part. But I do believe that narcissists probably have, as children, very sensitive temperaments, impulsive temperaments. And that impulsivity and sensitivity meets an environment where the caregivers in that environment are not fully equipped. Not that they're bad people, but that as parents, as caregivers, whether it's teachers or grandparents or whoever's the primary caregiver for this particular little one, is not equipped to provide the kinds of limits, the kind of discipline, the kind of frustration tolerance, the kind of empathy and affection and unconditional love that this little child needs for a number of different reasons. And so what you find with narcissists in their early years is that they're missing some things like unconditional love. There's a big emphasis on perform, do well, be the best, be the best, be the best. They are usually the child who was selected as having some gift, some talent, some special intelligence, someone who was going to make their family look good, someone who was going to follow the legacy of the family. So there are great burdens placed upon them as children with very little support in some cases. Now, there are the cases of the purely spoiled child who has just no limits and is completely indulged. But even still there's a level of deprivation because they are being deprived of the necessary discipline to prepare them to live in a world where other people exist, and people have to take turns and respect each other and care about each other. So I always say, narcissists are really good taskmasters. They grow up to be pretty good performers. Not all of them. Some of them will fail. Some of them will sabotage themselves. But many of them are successful. Many of them are really good at what they do. Where they have problems, where they fall short, are in their interpersonal relationships.
And I'm wondering, in your experience, how much do you think that the fact that we sometimes normalize pathological behavior, I don't really like the word pathology, but a behavior like this, workaholism or being successful, actually affects who will come into your practice?
Well, I think the ones who come into my practice are usually coming in because someone has said, you need to get help or we're done. Or someone has said, your job is on the line and you could lose it. You're going to lose your driver's license. They're in some legal trouble. They're losing contact with their adult children. They're feeling lonely. I mean, they might come in because they are feeling anxiety. They're having panic attacks. But usually they're not walking in with the hope of sitting down to long-term therapy and really going on a healing journey. They're coming in because they want to fix. They just fix it. Tell me what to do. Tell me what to say. Tell me how to make this go away so I can get back to my, action of being successful. So that's how most of them will come to me. And it's usually typically it's because a partner or a family member has reached out to me.
And I'm curious, as a person who has just entered psychotherapy training, your first unconscious encounter with someone who has narcissistic personality, and then how was that developing further?
You mean from the beginning of my career?
Yeah.
Yeah, I write about this in my book, actually, right in the beginning. I mean, it's unforgettable to me because I was so aware as a person who has I'm not shy. I'm not overconfident, but I'm certainly usually pretty comfortable in my skin. And so there I was as an intern in my work, doing my field work. And I met someone who I think probably, when I look back, would have fit on the narcissism spectrum. He was very entitled and easily agitated and had no frustration tolerance. And we were, I was dealing with a custody visitation dispute in my field placement. And he was so disparaging and so critical that I just found myself going silent. I felt like I was 5 years old. I felt like I could have been little me, at a time in my life when I was, dealing with, and I write about this too in my book, I was dealing with the nuns in my school who were highly authoritative and scary and controlling at the time when I was growing up. The rules were very strict. So I felt like that little kid who had to just give in, give up, avoid, apologize. And it was so interesting to me. On the one hand, I was terrified. On the other hand, I was very curious and fascinated by my own reaction, thinking, what just happened to me? So I went on to continue to kind of look at this with my then mentor, Dr. Jeffrey Young, who's the founder of Schema therapy. And we were working together on developing and expanding the approach and the model to begin to experiment with those with narcissism, narcissistic personality disorder. And it was quite exciting, quite exciting to be able to really see and understand what was necessary to make a difference, to have an effective outcome. And it was exciting to see myself, be able to evolve and to see what was necessary to be that sturdy, healthy adult and that expert that needed to be in the room and to be informed by my vulnerability, but not overwhelmed by it. And that's the key. When anyone who's listening to this, who is dealing with a narcissist, whether you're a therapist or you're just living with someone who's narcissistic, the most foolproof way of having a victory is when you can be assertive, you can speak your mind, you can say what's so, and you can do it in a way that doesn't require you to be shouting and screaming and angry and all filled with toxic energy pouring through your veins. You can just be in this place of kind of calm and steady, healthy self-righteousness, if you will. That ability to be able to say, I know this is what you're used to, but I'm not doing this dance anymore. I know this is what you're used to when you're in the workplace and you can command people to do things, but it's different in relationships and that doesn't work for me. There's something, you may get a reasonable response from the narcissist. You probably won't the first time or the second time. It may take, like most things, repetition, but it's a victory for you. To cross that bridge, either coming out of the silence of finding your voice again, or bringing down all that energy that has to be awakened with anger, which is so exhausting.
Yeah, and actually, that's an interesting. For me, the interesting point is that you have encountered this client of yours, and it wasn't freezing you. I mean, it did to an extent, probably. So I'm just wondering, what was the time span for you to make this conscious and use your curiosity to kind of explore yourself because of it?
Yeah, I mean, I was pretty conscious of it within, one or two meetings with someone. I mean, I became curious immediately because I could feel the shift in myself. Now, that's different than for someone who's so used to going into a subjugated state. Where you become inhibited and you become self-sacrificed and you forfeit your needs. If you're used to doing that much of your life and you haven't really reconciled those, what we would call schemas, those issues, those life themes, then you might not even notice that it's very different. Maybe in time, it will take a little while to feel just the agony of loneliness and the unfairness and the deprivation. But for those who have reconciled those issues, you're sort of shocked to see yourself like, I just switched into something that's familiar to me, but it's old. And that was really what began the whole process of wanting to look a little bit deeper at this and examine this and and kind of understand what it means. But a lot of it has to do with taking care of yourself first,
Yes.
figuring out what you need to do here to be sturdy enough in your skin to execute not only advocacy for yourself and assertiveness for yourself, but that empathy that might actually bring attention to your message.
I'm also curious about your personal journey of choosing psychology or psychotherapy as a vocation. How did that interest start?
It really wasn't something that I thought about initially. I mean, I never really set out in graduate school thinking I want to be a therapist. I mean, what I loved was the idea of systems. So I started out in sociology, looking at systems, looking at culture, looking at the integration of, the individual, and then the individual within the family, the individual within the larger society. I was very fascinated. I was also very interested in where people spend most of their time at work and workplace culture and how to improve our mental health and well-being in a workplace culture, the dynamics of relationships. So that was really where it started. And I was pretty much interested in group work and the power of group work. I ended up in psychotherapy. I ended up doing psychotherapy as part of a job that was multidimensional. And it was interesting to me and just, continued, although I never gave up my additional interests in group formats and teaching, which is one of my favorite things to do.
So now I'm really curious because there's a level of synchronicity. Like 2 days ago, I had, these thoughts of group and group work because of my group process. And so I'm now curious, what drew you to the group process, and what kind of group process do you like to be part of or think about?
Well, I mean, again, if we go back to the word empathy, there's no better place to sit and feel validated and understood and seen and known, where there's opportunity for healing, for being drawn out of your hiding places, than when you're sitting in a group. Group dynamics are so beautiful and so powerful and so healing. And it can be even a faster way of kind of getting to your destination of well-being when you're sitting in group. It's hard. Most people will shy away from it, but it's just a wonderful modality for change.
And do you use group work in your practice? And do narcissists actually ever end up in groups?
Maybe, but I'm not aware of any. It's always been kind of my warped dream. Some would say, Wendy, you're such a masochist, but it's been my dream to really facilitate a group for narcissists. I work mostly with narcissistic men. And so I think in fairness, I would probably need to have a co-leader, as we often do in schema therapy anyway, but I would have a co-leader who is male alongside me as a group leader. But I do run groups. I have one now that's online, but I've been running groups for years for partners of narcissists, family members who are dealing with narcissists, and that's an ongoing group.
And in terms of schema therapy and how it relates to group work, so I'm coming from the Gestalt field, so I know how that group process looks like. So I'm curious, what does the group process in schema therapy entails?
Group schema therapy has really been popularized by my colleagues Joan Farrell and Ida Shaw. And Joan and Ida have been, they were using schema therapy in their group work with patients with borderline personality disorder 35 years ago. And they sort of emerged in the global community of schema therapists, I don't know, maybe 11, 12, 13 years ago now. And they just became, they really had kind of stardom among our community because they are amazing in their contributions to the field. But group schema therapy looks like this. It's basically that members really learn to begin to identify their own personal narratives and unmet needs. So they learn about their schemas. They can see how what they've learned in their early lives has led them to develop certain coping styles and coping modes that may have been adaptive when they were little, but have become maladaptive over time. So it's the same thing we would do in individual work, except the group is doing it together. And each in group, you have the opportunity to be able to look at a fellow member in the group and say, it feels like you just went into your hiding place behind the wall, your detached mode. I wonder if little Mary is feeling some fear behind that wall. So members start learning how to identify and support one another to fortify this healthy adult in each other. We're working to try to really repair attachment ruptures, basically, because the model is so informed by attachment theory and developmental theories. And it's really critically important that, we're helping individuals to build this good parent who can act as a nurturer, who can re-script those core emotional experiences in a way that's accurate. It's just that it can go a little faster in group because everyone is looking out for everyone, and everyone can play parts of each other in the process, experience those parts kind of in the moment.
And I'm also curious because schema therapy has the schemas, which are kind of a language, a common language in the community. So how do you bring this language in a group that is just starting to form so that people can actually start to interact in a way where they actually have the knowledge of the schemas?
A little psychoeducation. So we spend some time just educating them what are schemas. We give them reading materials. We have inventories for them to complete so they can identify their schemas in this inventory. They talk about it together. So, the facilitator's incredibly active, as you can imagine, especially in the early days of helping them at their own pace, in their own comfortable way, to describe their how they came to learn about themselves and the world around them, how they came to understand how to predict the future. What was that blueprint that they developed once upon a time, and who gave them the messages that they carry inside of them? And so we look for, and we look for the long-standing issues of, in other words, what conditions in your life right now continue to activate those same feelings that you had when you were very small, those same behaviors, those same tendencies to be tough on yourself when you are. What are the conditions under which it happens now? So we look for sensory material, we look for activating stimuli. And so it's really just a process of very slowly, everyone's creating their own autobiography out loud. And we teach them. Schemas are traits, they are learned ways of believing about yourself and the world. They are connected to our bodies, so they have strong emotional and physiological sensation associated with them when they're triggered, and they're very rigid. So it's not just a passing thought because you're having a bad day. It's something that really has a deep familiarity inside yourself.
And also, I'm very curious about attachment and your framing of attachment, because many books kind of box people in avoidant, anxious, secure. And I'm wondering whether narcissists would fall under the avoidant, or is it that they can be anywhere on that spectrum?
They really can fit into different places on the spectrum because they show up with different levels of intensity, and some are more overt types of narcissists. They're much more openly extroverted, arrogant, expressive, entitled types. And then you have covert types who are much more, they're not quiet, but they're a little bit more inhibited, passive aggressive, more neurotic, vulnerable, fragile, martyrs, victims. There's that type too. And I think, different experiences in their attachment or lack of secure attachment play a role. I think it's not the only thing, but I think it plays a role.
And then in terms of not liability, but having a leverage in treating a narcissist, how do you reinforce that leverage over time in your sessions?
Yeah, leverage is very important. This is a great question, Alexandra, because without leverage, you can't have treatment with a narcissist. So there has to be some kind of a meaningful consequence, some kind of a high stake, something they don't want to face, or you won't have treatment. They don't usually come in with incentives because narcissists often feel entitled to get what they want. But when there's something they don't want to experience, your chances become higher of getting them into treatment and holding them in treatment. Over time, what becomes the leverage is the connection to the therapist. So that connection, especially in a needs meeting model like schema therapy, because we are helping them to begin to absorb, take in, and feel what it's like to be unconditionally cared for as a little child. We use the imagination. We do a lot of imagery for rescripting and reparenting. And once that starts to actually feel good, though they may not be admitting it, there is some leverage right there in your bond with them in the treatment room.
And also there's one thing that I remember my therapist telling me, that narcissists are personality that has never been born. And there's where somehow the empathy comes from me. Although they look like very confident, very strong, actually they're not really in touch with their needs. It feels like what they are really comes from the inside and from the outside, and there is no the inside out part. So I'm wondering, can we maybe paint this image of that part of the narcissist, because people usually are maybe intimidated by the success, but they don't see this other part.
Exactly. And again, that goes back to the idea of understanding and knowledge. The more you understand, the less intimidating they become. There was a very interesting study done not very long ago. It's called Diffusion Tensor imaging, and it's like an fMRI scan, except that it looks more at connectivity regions in the brain. And what was so fascinating about it was that the people with the lowest connectivity in the parts of the brain that would look at confidence and self-concept and self-assertiveness was very low, the lowest in people who had diagnostic narcissistic personality. So it doesn't show cause, obviously, but what it shows is that it makes some sense that they would have to be working so hard to overcompensate for not only those learned experiences, but the way it's affected the architecture of the brain. And yeah, most of that behavior is a compensation for a very deep sense of insecurity and a very deep sense of shame. So if you think about a little child, little tiny children who all need to be able to show fear and cry and reach for comfort and be cared for, and you have this child who's been appointed the grown-up way before their time, who is told that they are weak when they show emotion, or they're just ignored when they do it, or they are feeling used as some kind of a surrogate for a parent who's depressed and needs that child to be sort of the entertainer for them, the comfort for them, the trophy for them. The child feels basically manipulated and insecure about their own longings. And so it's that battle to push all those very innate emotions and needs behind the rock and be able to show up as someone who's really super strong and super powerful. And they get jobs and positions often in politics, in their careers, in their work, in their athletics, where they are very super powerful, right? So mission accomplished in that regard. But there's so much insecurity underneath. So it's like a lot of noise with a lot of hollowness and pain that they're not even aware of. Not even aware of.
And that word awareness, I was just thinking that the next question would be, how does a self-aware narcissist look like? And how does a narcissist going through a therapy that has actually worked perceive the world at the end?
When therapy works, I think this is true for everyone. But I think with regards to narcissists, what you'll see, you can get meaningful change. And there's nothing, and maybe because they're just such a hard population to work with, and I've worked with them for so long, that there's something incredibly rewarding about witnessing the courage of someone who's so masterful in so many ways, so larger than life, finding the courage that it takes to go deep into that world of shame and pain and emotional upset and so much vulnerability, to expose that they've never been able to expose, not only to expose it to me, expose it to themselves. And when you see that as a therapist, it's quite the privilege, to be able to facilitate that and to support someone in that work. But what you get in the end, when we have an effective treatment outcome, you have someone who is going to be far less triggered. So in other words, those schemas and those typical triggers where they're so sensitive to everything and everything's a criticism and they can't tolerate waiting their turn and they always feel like they should be able to have what they want when they want it, just like this. You start to see those conditions reduce. So there's less frequency of activation. When they do get triggered, because they will, we all do, we're human, the intensity is lower and the recovery is faster. And I just think that's probably what we would call success in any psychotherapy, right? Lower activation of triggers, lower intensity in our reactions, and faster recovery because we now have a clearer, more aware executive function in the brain that can see it and say, that was then, this is now, I'm getting triggered, can find ways to regulate ourselves much more quickly.
And actually, I'm also, my head is coming back also to the pain, the deep pain that these people harbor. And I think the sad part is how much we label them as devils or something, or even the representation. And I feel that you are the first person that doesn't forcefully bring this topic into the public, where like that sturdy self that is yet sturdy yet gentle self is somehow present. So I'm curious, was that built just by the fact that you have witnessed the pain, or where has this part of you, what brought this part of you to the public?
I think narratives are interesting, right? And I think, we all evolve from little tiny beings. And so, look, I can get as frustrated with a narcissist as anybody if I'm encountering one on the street or in the store. But one that's sitting in my office, filled with frustration because they don't want to be there in the beginning, and very critical and cynical towards me and towards psychotherapy and towards the world. Right now, I can be amused by it because I'm so used to it. In the beginning, it would be a bit scary and intimidating. But, when you see that child, when you look behind the scene, you look behind this, what some call the monster, the devil. I don't see a devil. I see someone who is not behaving very well, who can be very hurtful, very off-putting, can do great damage to people in their lives. They're also doing damage to themselves. It's just a slow burn. It will, in time, they'll be lonely souls. But, and they don't know how to have intimacy, really in a true, profound way. And that's very sad to me. I think, though, that when you encounter the child, when you meet the child in the imagination, when you see the child in photographs, which I use all the time in treatment, I have them bring me photographs from their childhood. And I keep those photographs, copies of those photographs with me always, because when they come into session, I want to be reminded of, this is my job, is to connect with that child. We have to reorganize the way this child is living in memory and the messages that were given. And it's just easy then to not only be empathic and make sense out of everything, but to even feel compelled to want to help the child to be able to feel secure enough so that these other monstrous behaviors can be reduced and weakened. You don't need it anymore. When you know you're fine, you don't need to prove yourself. When you know you're okay and you know you're acceptable, there's no need to perform.
Yeah. And one more question about the child and actually the impact that has on you as a therapist, and how do you share that impact back? Because I think a lot of the time the problem is holding them accountable for the impact they have on another person. Mm-hmm. And it's difficult for people who are not therapists because it has a lot of intensity. Yes. So I'm wondering what are the ways that you bring this back to them in a way that,
Again, using empathy can be your best strategy. And there's just so many ways to do this. And I share lots of examples of this in my book. But using we call this empathic confrontation in schema therapy. And what that means is that I can say things like, look, you may not mean to be hurtful. I don't think it's your intention to do harm. I think it's your intention to be right. And it's your intention to not feel foolish. I don't think it's your intention to be hurtful. So there's my empathy. But, and then there's the confrontation, but it's rather hurtful when you speak that way. And this is the reason you're having problems. So as a therapist, I can say that because I'm pointing out that I get it, but, right? It's not your fault that this is what you learned about how the world works, but it is your responsibility and only yours, with my help, to see if you can do this differently. And I can help you make that different, but it's up to you. So it's always the understanding with confrontation. When you add empathy to it, you eliminate, in many cases, all the other defensiveness and distractedness and the argumentativeness. It's not perfect, it's not magical, and they can still roll their eyes and stomp off or say something awful in return. Again, it's going to take repetition to build this new bridge, build this new highway in the brain, really. And that means being able to remain very sturdy in your own conviction and very knowledgeable about what you're up against, because it is hard. It's really hard. And lots of people will say to me, oh, Wendy, my narcissist would never listen to those words. They would just interrupt me and knock me right over, not literally, but, just. And I say, it's okay. Say them anyway, because there's no loss in you feeling yourself saying what's so, in you standing up and being an advocate for yourself, in you, as I like to say, dropping the seeds in the soil and just changing this whole dance and watching and seeing if you can get any leverage out of that. And if not, you have a more informed choice that you can then make about this relationship and how you proceed. You want to do that from your healthy best self, right? When we make choices from our healthy best self, which is well informed, it feels so much better than when we're doing it reactively. But I think empathic confrontation is one of the finest strategies and experiments that you can conduct when you're dealing with a narcissist.
Yeah. And in the interest of time, I would just go for a last question in terms of the success rates and also letting go of clients that you don't have leverage of. And although you're experienced therapist, does this still happen to you? And in what amount?
Your success rate is just going to depend so much upon the consistency of therapy, the model that you're practicing, the leverage that you have, the sturdiness that you can feel in yourself and you can maintain, because it's hard work. It's hard work. A lot of therapists say, no way, no thank you. I'm not interested. It's very difficult. You have leverage and then you lose leverage, because they know how to talk their way out of it with their partners. They know how to buy their way out of it when it comes to buying favors from people, even legal situations. So you can lose leverage. that you may have had in a very strong way. But you can have success, as I mentioned before. I will suspend or terminate therapy if I don't have consistency, because narcissists will be very notorious for, I have to leave early. I can't make the next 2 sessions. I have business. I have this. And so you want to have very clear policies around, showing up, participating consistently, because otherwise it's a setup for failure.
Mm-hmm. And talking about the hard work, actually, I remember the impact a group can have on me and on my body. And I'm just wondering, what is your self-care routine when there is this impact? And what do you do to ground yourself?
Well, I think as therapists, we all have to be engaged in self-care, because we are exposed to so much pain. We're just exposed to a lot of pain, whether it's our own personal activations because you're sitting with a narcissist, or it's your personal activations because you're sitting with someone who's dealing with a betrayal and it's traumatic and you remember having lived through that yourself, perhaps, or a health crisis that you've lived through yourself. So, we're human. And I think that because we sit with so much pain, and we sit with privilege, and we sit with pleasure too. So it's all there, but it's a lot of mind energy, a lot of mental and emotional energy. Do the things that you can do in your off time to, get that breath and that balance and that nourishment for your body and your mind that is necessary. In preparation for going into any session with a narcissist, I always take a few moments to be with little Wendy. So it's just a few moments to close my eyes and take some breaths and straighten my spine and just imagine that I tucked her into a very safe place. This is not her burden, not her responsibility. She's not the therapist. She's a child. And while I know I will feel elements of that part of myself because they're so important for me to remember the people out there that the narcissist is living with. So I'm informed, but not overwhelmed by my own vulnerability. And then, so my practice is always, a few moments of breathing, safe place for little me. Once upon a time, there was a little boy who, reminding myself quickly of the story of the person coming in, take a look at the photographs and open the door or open the Zoom. And it's just good preparation to ground yourself in your work and to remind yourself that, I can do this. I can do this.
And I'm wondering, has your experience expanded the capacity for you to hold the amount or the difference of narcissists that you can work with? So did you notice that you can take on 1 or 2 more clients with the experience, or it's just equally difficult regardless of your experience?
I think when you feel a greater capacity for dealing with a population, I think most therapists would say, I can look at my colleagues who work with individuals who have dissociative identity, and I can't imagine how they treat 5 or 6 of people with this diagnosis, because for me, it just feels I wouldn't know what to do. I mean, I would know something of what to do, but I'm not the expert in that area. So I think that when you do develop your expertise in an area, you become more comfortable and you have an approach that just makes sense. And you can guide someone, as hard as it is. You are on your mission and you are welcoming and really trying to cultivate that collaboration with the client, because this isn't, I'm not the sergeant, in this relationship. It needs to be collaborative, but that takes time and energy. So yeah, I can have a whole practice filled with people with issues of narcissism, which I have for many years. And, they are in various stages and various levels of intensity.
I can imagine that. So I will just go to the rapid fire question. And one is, what is a book, a present, or an idea that you like to gift the most?
A book, a present,
or an idea that you like to gift to other people?
To just friends, people out there in the world?
Friends.
These days, because so many of my friends like me, we've been around for a while on the planet. And so for many of us, the gift that we really enjoy is when, one of us donates to the other's favorite charities. And, we do that in honor of each other, because most of us have, gotten to a stage of life where, we can buy the things that we like, or, we're pickier than we ever were before. So we're a little fussier. So the gifts I give very often are things that I know they hold close to their heart in terms of charitable organizations, missions, service, activism of some sort, and try to provide support in their honor. And that tends to be a pretty popular gift these days. Although books are always a big favorite. If I know someone is a historical fiction lover, and I might think about a book that they might enjoy. And that's always a fun gift to give too.
And the next question is one of my favorites, and it's, what is an absurd thing about you that not many people know about?
There's so many, we don't have enough time. Oh, absurd. I don't know. I mean, my quirkiness kind of comes out with a lot of people, but I love to play the djembe drums. That's something that a lot of people know about me. So I am crazy for percussion, especially the African djembe drum, which I have studied for a little while. And so that's a passion of mine. I'm a former tap dancer, so you can hear the percussion theme here. So yeah, I mean, I kind of love the beats.
Wow. That's why this is my favorite question, because a lot of beautiful idiosyncrasies come out in this question. And one thing, because I often talk about success in this podcast, and I'm wondering what's your personal encounter with success, and whether you have any formulation for what that is for you.
I raised a beautiful human, and she is the light of my life, and she is now married and living a life that is not perfect, but fulfilling and happy. And I don't know that there's anything that we can feel more proud of or more in awe of than watching our children become good humans. And I watched my daughter become, not just because of me, I mean, she had fabulous grandparents and wonderful influencers in her life, but she's become a good human. And I think that's one of my greatest successes, if I can take some credit for that.
Definitely. And what kind of compliments do you like to receive?
I mostly enjoy when people tell me that they feel helped by my work. They feel that it's made a difference in their lives. There's kind of nothing more gratifying than knowing that the work you do, the work you love, the hard effort you've put into writing a book, giving a presentation, offering support or assistance is making a difference in someone's life in a meaningful way. And that is the best compliment that I can receive.
Yeah, thank you for your work, by the way. But and the last question is, which are the things that you have become more, and which are things that become less important for you with time?
I think my health has become the most important thing. Having I went through a terrible health crisis about 3 years ago, which was scary and awful, and learned, that kind of sort of old thing that people say, got to be grateful for your health. I really learned the lesson well, that without that, there's really not much else that matters when you don't have your health. So I'm very committed to taking good care of myself, and knowing that, some of it we can't control, but hoping that I can continue to remain healthy. I was very lucky and had good care. And I think that having good care and having good resources for that care is just so important. Having good luck. So I think my health has become important to me, health and happiness, and just really treasuring my life. Doesn't mean I don't complain, because I do. Ask anybody around me. But I think what's less important to me are the things that would have taken first place before my health, material things and things of that sort.
Well, on that note, I would like to thank you for being a part of the podcast, and not only that, for just doing the incredibly important work you're doing and for sharing with all of us. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexandra. Thanks for your wonderful questions. It was really nice to be with you.
You have just heard the story of Wendy Behary, a practicing schema therapist with more than 30 years of postgraduate experience and the founder and director of the Cognitive Therapy Center of New Jersey and the Schema Therapy Institute of New Jersey, NYC, and DC. Her private practice is primarily devoted to treating narcissists, their partners, and people dealing with them. She is an author of a widely known book on narcissism, and you can reach her on her webpage www.disarmingthenarcissist.com. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and I hope you're enjoying the process.